A blue projection appears on a screen. Standing in front of it, I wait patiently for the film to start. As I watch, my eyes dart from one corner to another, anticipating action. But the screen stays blue, its smooth surface punctuated by black fissures, breaks in the film's celluloid. I become anxious in my restlessness as I begin to fidget. My breathing quickens as my frustration begins to rise, but suddenly a bell chimes. I look for the bell, but cannot see it. For a moment, I'm plunged back into silence and start to shift, but my ears prick up again at the call of a man's voice.
You say to the boy, "Open your eyes." When he opens his eyes and sees the light, you make him cry out, saying, "O blue, come forth. O blue, arise. O blue, ascend. O blue, come in."
I startle at the word you, unmoored by the call of this voice. I know I cannot be the object of this call. The screen divides us. But the speaker's invocation to come in rings like an invitation, and as I continue to listen, my senses begin to broaden. Suddenly, my body awakens. This is the beginning of Derek Jarman's film Blue. Like other works that utilize visual abstraction, the film challenges conventional standards of image production that inform figurative and pictorial traditions. Blue, however, uses abstraction to tell a complex story about AIDS, a disease that is overwhelmingly represented in popular narratives through highly embodied imagery. Blue premiered at the Venice Biennale in July 1993, 6 months before Jarman's death from AIDS-related complications. By this time, Derek Jarman had already established himself as a prolific filmmaker and one of the progenitors of what B. Ruby Rich has termed the new queer cinema. Jarman's films prior to Blue center on tropes of a gay heroic, and in films like 1976's Sebastiana, 1978's Jubilee, 1990's The Garden, and 1992's Edward II, he imagined narratives in which gay male protagonists are persecuted and eventually martyred for living out queer lives in distinctly sensual and embodied ways. For Jarman, these narratives came out of a political need to represent queer lives and the ways in which dominant structures of heteronormativity both counter and suppress expressions of queerness. These films, however, also posited a troubling collapse between queer sexuality and violent forms of discipline in ways that, as Leo Bersani and Ulysse Dutoit might suggest, visually imagine queer embodiments as terminating in violent death. Blue entered into production in 1992, shortly after the release of Edward II. By then, Jarman's health was deteriorating, and he was facing his own potentially physically violent death. His bodily faculties were shutting down, and he'd slowly begun to lose his vision as a result of the AIDS-related illness cytomegalovirus. At this time, major studio films about AIDS were gaining increased attention in the mainstream. These films brought a heightened awareness and consciousness at a time when AIDS awareness was predominantly defined by news reports, like Lawrence K. Altman's 1981 article, Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals, from the New York Times. These articles informed popular understandings about the medical particularities of the epidemic and its onset. In doing so, however, reports like Altman's also reinforced heteronormative fears that equated homosexuality with disease. As further research dispelled myths about HIV transmission, the popular discourse around AIDS changed, and films like 1986's An Early Frost attempted to challenge then queerphobic representations by dramatizing AIDS narratives in a more human light. By showing the effects that AIDS had on the lives of individuals, these films tried to put a face on the epidemic. In doing so, though, they also reified stereotypes that equated homosexuality with disease through visual paradigms, such as this one, seen from a still from An Early Frost, that depicted extreme AIDS symptoms like emaciated bodily frames, string-like hair, and bruises and lesions on the face caused by Kaposi's sarcoma. Films like An Early Frost showed these symptoms in order to reveal the horrifying physical effects that AIDS can have on the body. In doing so, however, these films also exclude the possibility of narratives that depict persons with AIDS as living healthy lives by equating HIV and AIDS with deathly embodiments. The sickbed image seen here reappears in later films like 1989's Longtime Companion, 1993's Philadelphia, and 2013's Behind the Candelabra. The continued reproduction of this trope set a standard of representation that only imagines AIDS through its most extreme symptoms. These images, though, also defined a standard of representation that imagined AIDS through what Joseph Pugliese might describe as the white male template body implied in dominant cultural narratives. Despite historically high HIV infection rates in minoritarian communities in both the United States and abroad, these mainstream narratives almost uniformly excluded women and persons of color from the visual turn. From the outset, Jarman intended Blue to be an autobiographical film about his AIDS experience. Given the prevalence of deathly queer bodies in his work and the prevalence of diseased queer bodies in mainstream AIDS representations, Blue could have easily utilized the tropes seen here or here. But in refusing to engage with culturally prevalent AIDS imagery, Blue forces us to think about the bodies that are not visually present. Instead, Blue uses different sound-based narratives read by 4 unique speakers, Nigel Terry, John Quentin, Tilda Swinton, and Jarman himself, to tell a fragmented and multivocal story about AIDS experiences. For 70 minutes, there are no cuts or pans or zooms. Instead, the saturated blue screen fills our visual frame with unchanging color as these voices fill the viewing space. Just as the screen functions instrumentally by positioning and diverting our gaze, it also becomes a device that, though seemingly static, activates our own embodied awareness of the film's audio narrative. In doing so, Blue awakens our capacity for phenomenological experiences beyond the gesture of the look through an heightened awareness to sound. Film scholar Vivian Sobchak argues that listening to sound both disorients and affects our viewing consciousness. Because sound has less of an implied representational distance than images, it can be employed to create a different felt experience that produces sensations of closeness that images can only represent. Throughout Blue, Jarman's narrators test the limits of this closeness by describing many of the AIDS symptoms seen in those earlier film stills in visceral bodily detail. Amidst these moments, though, Jarman also describes accounts of deep and even ecstatic pleasure and sensual experiences outside of pain. About halfway through the film, the narrative gives yet another account of his worsening symptoms. Abruptly, though, he goes silent until an echoed voice from an intercom calls out Jarman's name. Suddenly, a techno beat comes on the soundtrack, slowly pulsing until it picks up at a rapid tempo.
Impatient youths of the sun, burning with many colors, flick combs through hair in bathroom mirrors. Fucking with fusion and fashion. Dance in the beams of emerald lasers.
As the pulse of the dance beat begins to play, the viewer is invited to feel the same pulse of excitement that the speaker feels, and in this moment of sensorial collapse, Jarman stakes a place for shared pleasure and shared sensory experience in Blue. In asking his viewers to participate in this heightened moment of sensual pleasure, he claims a place for AIDS representation that does not immediately equate AIDS with death, but represents the actual embodied sensations and pleasures that these persons can feel and do feel. Jarman's memory of cruising a club has an erotic thrill because it is highly sensual and wholly physical. And in this moment, he does not specify whom he is cruising in this recollection, creating a deliberate ambiguity here and the lack of pronouns. By refusing to specify a person or object to cruise, Jarman signals that the object of his cruising may be any body, or for that matter, a plurality of bodies, regardless of embodied signifiers of gender or race. In this plurality, Blue also offers the possibility for telling stories about AIDS that are not delimited by the external representations or normativities seen here as visually determined, but are instead open to the intersectionality of many voices and bodies. So why is this shift in representation significant? And why is it important to discuss it in relation to AIDS narratives? Recent appraisal of AIDS narratives from the late 80s and early 90s all too willingly characterized the epidemic as if it were a crisis relegated to our historical past. But in December of last year, the New York Times reported that the number of new HIV infections in the United States alone remains stubbornly stuck at 50,000 a year, despite years of progress in preventing HIV in white and middle-class communities. So while AIDS-related deaths continue to rise in non-white communities, visual representations of the disease, at least in mainstream forms, still imagine it against the reference body of white men. In order to prevent the spread of HIV, we need to advocate for cultures of representation that accurately represent the diverse communities that AIDS affects. And Jarman makes no claims to represent the entire range of possible AIDS experiences in Blue. But in opening his own narrative to these moments of plurality, he advocates for an ethics of representation that is not prescriptive. Instead, he suggests the potential for new forms of AIDS narrative that are mutable, and in such, more representative of the multiplicity of subjects and lives that are affected by AIDS. Thank you.